Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers identifications, reasonable suspicion, and obstruction, and is brought to us by al.com's channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. On May 22nd, 2022, Pastor Michael Jennings of the Vision of Abundant Life Church in Sylacauga, Alabama, was watering his out-of-town neighbor's flowers in Childersburg, Alabama, when Officer Chris Smith, Officer Jay Gable, and Sergeant Jeremy Brooks of the Childersburg Police Department responded to a 911 call made by another neighbor, Amber Roberson, who reported that a, quote, younger black male and a gold SUV that she did not recognize were at the house while the owners were away. Officer Smith parked his vehicle and approached Pastor Jennings before either of the other officers arrived.
Howdy.
Hey man, how's it going?
Pretty good. What you doing here, man?
Water flower.
All right, they saying that, is that your vehicle?
Nah,
It's not?
it's the neighbor's vehicle.
The neighbors? You live here?
Nah, I don't live here.
Okay. They saying that this vehicle is not supposed to be here and you're not supposed to be
Who's
here.
saying that?
They called about it. I don't know who called.
I'm supposed to be here. I'm Pastor Jennings. I live across the street.
You're Pastor Jennings?
Yes, I'm looking out for their house while they gone.
Okay.
Watering their flowers.
Okay. Well, that's cool. Now, do you have like ID and
Oh
all?
no, man. I'm not gonna give you no ID.
Why not?
I ain't did nothing wrong. And they did
Well,
nothing
you look,
suspicious.
listen, I'm not saying do nothing wrong.
Dog, listen,
There's a suspicious person.
Look, I used to be a police officer in Goodwater. Don't come here with that. Okay?
Look, man, don't do this to me.
Yeah.
There's a suspicious person in the yard, and if you're not one to identify yourself,
I don't have to identify myself. It's not a stop and identify state. I live right over there across the street. Who called y'all?
you
Is
live
a black
here?
man
He
out
don't
here
live here.
watering his neighbor flowers, and you think
I'm not saying
doing
nothing
something illegal?
about.
You have no right to approach me if I ain't did nothing suspicious or nothing wrong.
Listen.
Told him I'm a pastor. I pastor until I don't want to hear.
Sir,
You want to lock me up? Lock me up.
nobody wants to lock
Lock
you
me.
up.
I'm not showing y'all anything. I'm gonna
What?
continue to water
We
these
have a
flowers.
call.
I don't care who called y'all. Lock me up and see what happens. I want you to.
Hey, man, just come here and talk to us.
I'm
What?
gonna
What?
water these back flowers is what I'm finna do.
No, you're going to catch an obstruction charge if you keep walking away.
You can do whatever you want. Do it. Do it.
We're just trying to talk to you, man. Come here. I'm telling you, we got one that's not listening to us. Look, man, let me see your phone. Let me see your phone, dude. Just calm down, okay?
No.
Stop.
I like this.
Okay. We're just trying to talk to you and
Sir,
see.
I don't want to argue with you, okay?
All right,
Yeah.
go ahead and do what
I
you
don't
gotta do,
want to
dog.
arrest you either.
Do what you got to do. Go on and
Okay.
lock me up.
Look, just have a seat.
It's
You're
already
not
a
locked
lawsuit.
up, you're
It's
just-
already a lawsuit,
Yes,
dog.
sir. Yes, sir.
It's already a
Okay.
lawsuit.
Just have a seat, okay?
Sit down, man. Just
Okay, let me call my wife.
you're not calling
My
nobody.
son just got racially profiled in Michigan. He's got his master's degree. He's an athletic director. 3 police profiling came in. I was ex-police officer from Goodwater. I told you I'm a pastor.
Okay, look, man.
Who called y'all?
We.
That's what I'm
I
trying
don't
to
have
tell
to
you.
ID
You
myself.
will not
I don't have to-
listen.
I have a call on you. You have to identify yourself to me.
I
You
don't.
understand what
No,
I'm
I
telling
don't.
you?
No, I don't.
Officer Gable screams at Pastor Jennings, claiming that he must identify himself to the officers because they received a call on him. In fact, throughout the encounter, the officers repeatedly claim they have a right to identify any person involved in a 911 call. However, as we have discussed many times on ATA, officers cannot arrest an individual for refusing to identify themselves unless they have the reasonable suspicion necessary to detain them. And the state has enacted a stop and identify law that requires the individual to identify themselves under the circumstances. Under Section 15-5-30 of the Alabama Code, a police officer, quote, may stop any person abroad in a public place whom he reasonably suspects is committing, has committed, or is about to commit a felony or other public offense, and may demand of him his name, address, and an explanation of his actions. While Pastor Jennings was on private property when the officers approached him and demanded his identification, that does not necessarily mean that he was not in a public place for the purposes of this statute. In the 1983 case of Schultz versus State, the Court of Criminal Appeals of Alabama held that a vehicle was in a public place within the meaning of Section 15-5-30 when it was in an open cotton field on private property 300 or 400 yards from the highway because, quote, its headlights and its movement were clearly visible visible from the public roadway from which it was cited by the deputies. Applying this logic, a court would likely conclude that Pastor Jennings was in a public place for the purposes of the Alabama Stop and Identify statute, as he was much closer to the public street, and his actions would have been clearly visible to anyone using that roadway. However, the officers still would not be permitted to detain and identify Pastor Jennings under this statute unless they had reasonable suspicion that he was committing, had committed, or was about to commit a felony or public offense. We will discuss whether the officers had reasonable suspicion later in this episode, but for now, it's important to note that even if the officers had the required level of suspicion to detain and identify Pastor Jennings, the statute would only authorize them to demand his name, his address, and an explanation of his actions. And Pastor Jennings provided this information within the first few seconds of his encounter with Officer Smith. Although he did not provide his first name and merely stated that he lived across the street instead of listing his exact address, the officers did not ask him to provide this information. Instead, they repeatedly demanded that he provide identification, despite the fact that the statute clearly does not authorize them to do so.
I think it's going to be...
Please call my wife right quick.
We're going to wait off. All right. Well, y'all sit with him, Jeremy. I'm going to go over here and see if it's 6 people over here that call. Hey, you know what? 10:15. 10:15. 10:15. I ain't going to sit there and have that, dude.
Will you let my wife...
No, you ain't letting nothing now.
I'm on this car right
I mean, I don't know if they called. I mean, I saw the gold SUV. So, and I saw him outside, and all I did said, "Hey, man, do you live here?" "No." "Is that your car?" "No, it's the neighbor's." Do you know that gentleman back?
Yeah.
You do?
Yeah.
Does he have
He lives right there.
Okay, does he have permission here to be watering flowers?
He may, because they are friends.
Okay.
And they went out of town today, so
Right.
he may be watering their flowers.
Okay.
It'd be completely normal.
Okay,
And
is
that's fine.
that's fine. If he would have said, "Hey, I got this," gave his identification because he's a suspicious person, he said that's not his vehicle, it's their vehicle.
We
Okay.
have a call. Like,
Yeah.
we're here
Okay.
because we're called here. I don't know who called, but somebody did.
Yeah, he lives right there, and he would be watering their flowers. This is probably my fault.
Okay, do you know who Roy Malum is? That's the person that owns that vehicle, Roy
Ask
Malum.
him who owns the house. I don't know the guy's name.
Listen, let me talk to you. Who is Roy Malum? That's you, ain't it?
I'm Michael Jennings, sir.
You're Michael Jennings. Who is Roy Malum?
I don't know.
Okay, that's who that vehicle belongs to.
Yeah, that's
Who
all I
lives
know.
he-
His name is Roy.
That's who lives here?
That's Roy. I call him Roy and call his wife Connie, and I've been dealing with him for 7 years that I've been living here.
They are friends.
Yeah,
I'm
I
sorry
got to
about
keep
that.
their flowers watered.
Listen to me, man. Listen to
We
me.
are
Anytime the
asking
police
for
come out and they
She'll
say,
bring it, Donna.
"We want to identify you," you have to identify yourself because there's a reasonable suspicion, there's a reasonable man, there's a
That has to
vehicle.
commit a crime.
There's a reasonable suspicion that you're here. It's not a crime.
Yeah.
If you would have said, "Yeah, here's my name, here's everything," we were like,
I
"Okay."
told him my name.
You didn't tell me your name.
I decided. He asked me who I was. I said,
You didn't give it to me when I first
Pastor
asked.
Jennings. Pastor Jennings.
That's not a name.
What was
That's
that?
a pastor.
Yeah.
I need your
The way
name.
y'all handle this situation was totally wrong.
Officer Smith once again claims that Pastor Jennings was required to identify himself because they had reasonable suspicion, but does not identify what crime they suspected him of committing. As the Supreme Court explained in the 1989 case of United States versus Socolow, quote, "The concept of reasonable suspicion is not readily, or even usefully, reduced to a neat set of legal rules. In evaluating the validity of a stop such as this, we must consider the totality of the circumstances, the whole picture." In the 2014 case of Navarrete versus California, the court considered the issue of reasonable suspicion based on tips received from 911 calls, explaining that, quote, "We have firmly rejected the argument that reasonable cause for an investigative stop can only be based on the officer's personal observation, rather than on information supplied by another person. Of course, an anonymous tip alone seldom demonstrates the informant's basis of knowledge or veracity, but under appropriate circumstances, an anonymous tip can demonstrate sufficient indicia of reliability to provide reasonable suspicion to make an investigatory stop." The court also clarified that 911 calls are not, quote, "per se reliable," and that, quote, "even a reliable tip will justify an investigative stop only if it creates reasonable suspicion that criminal activity may be afoot. Depending on the situation, a 911 call reporting the presence of an unknown person from a neighbor, even an anonymous one, could create reasonable suspicion of various criminal activities under certain circumstances. For instance, Section 13A-7-4 of the Alabama Code states that, quote, A person is guilty of criminal trespass in the third degree when he knowingly enters or remains unlawfully in or upon premises. And Section 13A-7-1 explains that, quote, a person enters or remains unlawfully in or upon premises when he is not licensed, invited, or privileged to do so, and defines the term premises to include any building or real property. Similarly, Section 13A-11-32 of the Alabama Code states that, quote, a person commits the crime of criminal surveillance if he intentionally engages in surveillance while trespassing in a private place. However, when Officer Smith approached Pastor Jennings, his personal observations of a man watering flowers, combined with Pastor Jennings's clear explanation of what he was doing, should have dissipated any reasonable suspicion that may have existed based on the 911 call. Although reasonable suspicion does not need to rule out entirely the possibility of innocent conduct, a court would likely find that the officers did not have the reasonable suspicion that would be necessary to constitutionally detain Pastor Jennings, as the innocent nature of his conduct was more than evident.
Well, listen.
You're racial profile.
We're not racial profile.
Yes, you did.
No, sir. No, sir. We're not about that.
I told
okay?
you I was here watering the flowers.
How do I know that's the truth?
Because I had the water hose in my hand. I was watering all the flowers.
Look, let's sit back in here.
Okay.
What is your social?
I'm not going to give you my social.
You need to give me your social.
I'll give you my name. That's all I'm going to give you. You're not going to run no 27 and 28 on me and get me in the system for no reason.
What are we going to do with him?
You'll see the charge of, I guess, disorderly conduct, the failure to obey a police officer. He refused to give any information.
He said he's not going to give me his social, but he gave me his name and date of birth.
Okay, and she's saying the same thing. She won't give her name because he got arrested.
I mean, this could have been all avoided if he would have just...
Well, I told her that.
And every time I try to tell him, he just says, you good, man, I appreciate this. I appreciate it, you know, because
all he does is racial profiling, he's suing. That's all he would say. You couldn't talk to him.
Well, I wasn't going to detain him until he walked away, started coming to the front yard saying he's coming to water these plants. And then he gets his phone out and he just keeps speeding walking away. And I said, okay, fine, come here.
What's the charge? So just obstruction?
Disorderly or obstruction.
Obstruction.
I'll just do obstruction.
Obstruction of governmental operations.
You know, we got to have some.
Yeah.
After already placing Pastor Jennings under arrest, the officers discuss what crime they intend to charge him with, briefly considering a disorderly conduct charge before settling on obstruction of governmental operations. Under Section 13A-11-7 of the Alabama Code, an individual commits the crime of disorderly conduct if, with, quote, intent to cause public inconvenience, annoyance, or alarm, or recklessly creating a risk thereof, they engage in fighting or in violent, tumultuous, or threatening behavior, make unreasonable noise, use abusive or obscene language, or make an obscene gesture in a public place, disturb any lawful assembly or meeting of persons without lawful authority, obstruct vehicular or pedestrian traffic or a transportation facility, or congregate with others in a public place and refuse to comply with a lawful order of law enforcement to disperse. Clearly, none of Pastor Jennings' actions during this encounter came remotely close to violating this statute, and that is likely why the officers ultimately decided to charge him violating Section 13A-10-2 of the Alabama Code, which states that, quote, a person commits the crime of obstructing governmental operations if, by means of intimidation, physical force, or interference, or by any other independently unlawful act, he intentionally obstructs, impairs, or hinders the administration of law or other governmental function, or intentionally prevents a public servant from performing a governmental function. However, as a U.S. District Court in the Middle District of Alabama explained in the 2013 case of Kleinschnitz versus Ferris, quote, the public servant must be legally authorized to undertake the action in question in order for interference to constitute obstruction. In other words, this statute would not apply to illegal action by a public servant in performing an unauthorized function. This means that if a court reviewing this situation concluded that the officers did not have reasonable suspicion to detain Pastor Jennings for watering his neighbor's flowers, then Pastor Jennings could not be convicted of obstruction for refusing to identify himself. Of course, as we discussed earlier, Pastor Jennings did not refuse to identify himself. He refused to provide identification. Because the obstruction statute requires that the obstruction be committed by means of intimidation, physical force, or interference, or by any other independently unlawful act, and it was not unlawful for Pastor Jennings to refuse to provide his identification in this situation, a court would likely determine that he could not be convicted of obstruction for his actions, even if the officers had reasonable suspicion.
In the bond book, if it's not listed, just do the lowest one, the 500. That way we won't be overcharging or anything like that.
He seems like a reasonable, nice guy. I don't understand. I'll tell you what all happened if you like, man.
Okay.
That's my
Okay.
dog. They're
Yeah.
right
You're
there.
good.
Hold on, his
Thanks
wife
so
is
much.
coming, so you can do this once.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so he's been identified.
I'll
He's
tell you what
identified
happened.
himself.
We
She's
get a call
identified
here.
him and verified
Her.
who he is and where he lives.
We say, hey,
Your phone is
sir,
at
we
the
have a
house.
call here.
What do you want us to
Need
do?
you to identify yourself, please. Like, no, I'm not identifying
Okay.
myself. You don't have to identify me. We wouldn't listen. He's walking away, so of
Okay,
course
so
we
what do you
detain
want
him.
us to do?
We don't know what's going on.
Gotcha.
If she does tell us it's a mistake and all that stuff, at this point, he's already collected the charge. Once we place him on arrest, we can't unarrest him. Does that make sense? All we told him is that if you're here to water the plants, that's okay. Just please identify yourself, just your name, and let us call the owner. And he didn't want to do that until he caught the charge. He's going to go to the Childersburg Police Department. We're going to process an arrest report. It's going to be one charge for obstruction of our investigation. He'll go to the jail. He can bond out immediately. You can get your bondsman. It'll be 10% of the bond.
So it'd be like $50.
We're not investigating a crime. We're investigating a call. And we have a right to identify anybody involved in that call. Walking
why
away
he's
and
gotta
yelling
go
at
to
us
jail.
and telling us we have no right, and we have a call there. But if he wants to fight it in court, that's fine.
Is it okay if I talk to him?
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Is it okay?
Yes, ma'am. That's fine.
We need to clear up.
Huh?
Clear up.
Need to clear up?
Yeah.
Immediately after this incident, Pastor Jennings was taken to jail and charged with obstructing governmental operations. However, a few days later, on June 2nd, 2022, Childersburg Police Chief Richard B. McClelland issued a statement announcing that he had requested that the charge be dropped. In his statement, Chief McClelland indicated that he reviewed the 911 call and body camera footage and interviewed Officer Smith, Officer Gable, and Sergeant Brooks, and that, as a result of his investigation, he recommended to the municipal judge of the city of Childersburg, quote, that the warrant be dismissed with prejudice, and the judge has dismissed the aforementioned charge against Michael Jennings. It should be noted that Chief McClelland resigned from his position on August 11th, 2022, a few months after his involvement in a single-vehicle traffic accident where, according to the crash report, quote, there was a strong odor of an alcoholic beverage inside the vehicle. An investigation into the crash is ongoing and has been turned over to the Office of Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall. Pastor Jennings is represented by an attorney and plans to file a federal lawsuit in the Northern District of Alabama. As of the date of writing this episode, no lawsuit has been filed. Overall, the Childersburg officers get an F for arresting Pastor Jennings when he had not committed a crime, demanding that he provide identification when he was not legally required to do so, and maintaining a hostile and aggressive demeanor for the duration of the interaction. Throughout the entire encounter, the officers demonstrated fundamental misunderstandings of reasonable suspicion when they have the authority to identify an individual and the information that individuals are required to provide during an investigation. The officers repeatedly claimed that they have the authority to detain and identify an individual simply because they are investigating a call, and told Pastor Jennings he was required to provide identification and his social security number when he was not obligated to give them either. Based on their comments, it appears that the officers believe that receiving a 911 call about someone is the same thing as having reasonable suspicion to detain them. But the relevant case law makes it abundantly clear that this expansive interpretation of the scope of police authority is entirely inaccurate. I strongly urge these officers to study and understand the Constitution they are required to uphold and the limitations that it places on their authority. Pastor Jennings gets an A+ for maintaining a relatively calm demeanor throughout the interaction, refusing to provide identification when the law did not require him to do so, even under the threat of wrongful arrest, and pursuing civil legal action, even though the charge against him was dropped. When Officer Smith first approached him, Pastor Jennings immediately provided his name and an explanation of what he was doing, despite it being plainly apparent in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. However, when the officers refused to accept his explanation without seeing his identification, Pastor Jennings took a stand to defend his rights, and I commend him for continuing to do so by preparing to file a lawsuit. Let us know if there is an interaction or legal topic you would like us to discuss in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out my second channel for even more police interaction content.